January 19th, 2016, Tuesday of the second week in Ordinary Time.
A reading from the first book of Samuel. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve for Saul, whom I have rejected as king of Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem, for I have chosen my king from among his sons." But Samuel replied, "How can I go? Saul will hear of it and kill me." To this the Lord answered, "Take a heifer along and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I myself will tell you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I point out to you." Samuel did as the Lord had commanded him. When he entered Bethlehem, the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and inquired, "Is your visit peaceful, O seer?" He replied, "Yes, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. So cleanse yourselves and join me today for the banquet." He also had Jesse and his sons cleanse themselves and invited them to the sacrifice. As they came, he looked at Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is here before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not judge from his appearance or from his lofty stature, because I have rejected him. Not as man sees does God see, because he sees the appearance, but the Lord looks into the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and presented him before Samuel, who said, "The Lord has not chosen him." Next Jesse presented Shammah, but Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." In the same way, Jesse presented 7 sons before Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any one of these." Then Samuel asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse replied, "There is still the youngest who is tending the sheep." Samuel said to Jesse, "Send for him. We will not begin the sacrificial banquet until he arrives here." Jesse sent and had the young man brought to them. He was ruddy, a youth handsome to behold, and making a splendid appearance. The Lord said, "There, anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel, with the horn of oil in hand, anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David. When Samuel took his leave, he went to Ramah. The word of the Lord.
The responsorial psalm. The response is, "I have found David, my servant." Once you spoke in a vision, and to your faithful ones you said, "On a champion I have placed a crown. Over the people I have set a youth. I have found David, my servant. I have found David, my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him, that my hand may be always with him, and that my arm may make him strong. I have found David, my servant. He shall say of me, 'You are my Father, my God, the rock, my Savior.' And I will make him the firstborn, highest of the kings of the earth. I have found David, my servant."
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. As Jesus was passing through a field of grain on the Sabbath, his disciples began to make a path while picking the heads of grain. At this, the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need, and he and his companions were hungry? How he went into the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of offering that only the priests could lawfully eat, and shared it with his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That is why the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
January 19th, Tuesday of the second week in Ordinary Time. The first reading comes from 1 Samuel 16, 1-13. In this passage the Lord asked Samuel, How long will you grieve for Saul, whom I rejected as king of Israel? Now Saul had done two things which caused God to reject him. The first is that he failed to apply the ban to all of the people of the Amalekites when they were defeated by the Israelites. Remember, the ban means kill every single person. And the second thing was that Saul was waiting for Samuel to perform a sacrifice before he attacked the Philistines. Well, Samuel didn't come, and finally Saul performed the sacrifice. And Samuel saw that as an offense to his honor because Samuel was the one who was supposed to perform this sacrifice. Now that's a bit ambiguous because David and Solomon get away with performing sacrifices when they bring the Ark of the Covenant to the city of Jerusalem, when they dedicate the temple. Later on in the history of Israel, the king will be forbidden to act as a priest, but in the early days, it was seen as part of his responsibility. Nevertheless, this is one of two reasons that God rejects Saul. And so Samuel has to choose another leader for Israel. Remember, up to this time, the leaders of Israel are chosen on a charismatic basis. It's not that the son of the king becomes the king. Rather, someone else has to be chosen. And so Samuel goes to Bethlehem, as God has ordered, and he visits Jesse. Jesse has a number of sons. Samuel sees them and thinks that the most handsome, the oldest, the strongest would be the king of Israel. But God sees the hearts, and so he waits until David is called from shepherding the flock. And he tells him, this is the one whom you are to anoint as the new king of Israel. Notice that God judges people according to what's in their hearts and not according to external standards. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of this, that we judge people according to their integrity, according to what's inside of them, rather than the color of their skin, rather than their religion. And God judges us in just this manner. Now we could well ask, why is it that David is seen as so good when later on he'll commit adultery, he'll commit murder? And we really don't have an answer for that. God does what God does. And we have to learn to surrender to God's will, even when it doesn't fully make sense to us. That was one of the theological problems that really troubled Israel. The Gospel is from Mark 2:23-28. As Jesus' disciples are passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, they pluck a little bit of it in order to eat it. Now, according to the law of Israel, this is okay as long as you're not really harvesting the grain. The Pharisees, however, have taken the law to its widest possible interpretation. They have built a fence around the law. That's the phrase they use. They take it to its widest possible interpretation to make sure that they haven't broken the smallest part of the law. So they forbid plucking grain on the Sabbath. They ask Jesus, why are you allowing them to do what's unlawful on the Sabbath? Well, it's only unlawful for them. And Jesus says, don't you know what David did when he was hungry, when he was fleeing away from Saul? How Abiathar gave him the showbread that was legitimate only for the priest to eat. Bread was put out before the altar, and it was there for 7 days. After that, it could be eaten by the priest, but not by the people, because it had been dedicated to the Lord. Well, the chief priest of that shrine gave that bread to David and his followers because they were hungry. They had run away without provisions. The only difficulty of this is that it wasn't Abiathar who did it. It was Ahimelech, Abiathar's father. Is this a possible error on the part of Jesus? Remember, errors are not sins. Jesus just wasn't sure of who it was. This is human ignorance. Sometimes we confess when we make mistakes, and mistakes are not sins unless we intend to make them. This is simply a mistake. This gives us an example of Jesus' ignorance, of his not knowing. We know that he doesn't know everything. He doesn't know when the end of the world is. This is another example. And Jesus closes the passage, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That the reason for the Sabbath is so that we have a time of rest, a time when we can worship God, when we can put together our thoughts, when we can serve others. And the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. He doesn't call himself Messiah or God. He calls himself the Son of Man, a title taken from Daniel, where the Son of Man receives power and authority. But whenever Jesus talks about himself as being the Son of Man, he also takes vocabulary from the songs of the suffering servant. This is his self-definition of what he will be, one who will suffer for the people, but then will receive power and authority. And so Jesus says, I have power to determine how the Sabbath is to be celebrated. The Pharisees thought they had that authority. Jesus is appropriating it to himself. And may God bless us.